Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Amit Kumar and I am the Director of Marketing at Microexcel. Microexcel is the leading technology services and solutions provider for global customers. We'll begin our webinar on Microsoft Teams, architecting teamwork in the cloud and in the hybrid real world now. And our presenter today is Justin Sypek. Before we start, just a little housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type those into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. I'll bring them up during the presentation and we will also have some time for questions at the end. We are also recording the webinar and it will be shared with all the attendees after we conclude the webinar. Now, without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Justin, who is our presenter today. And Justin brings nearly 2 decades of experience in architecting, designing, developing solutions using Microsoft technologies. As a Microsoft certified professional and technology specialist in SharePoint, he has delivered progressive and innovative solutions for various industries, including healthcare, insurance, high-tech software, consumer packaged goods, financial services, etc. Justin is also a recognized thought leader throughout the Microsoft community. He has presented at many of the user groups and conferences across the US. You will also frequently see him around Microsoft campus in the New York, New Jersey, Chicago, California, where he facilitates business seminar and strategic workshops with the Microsoft team members. Justin, with that short introduction, I'll turn the mic to you.
Thanks, Amit. Appreciate it. And again, welcome everybody. So just real quick, I wanted to run through a short agenda for the meeting today. So Microsoft had asked me to present a 4-hour workshop at local MTC sessions, as Amit had mentioned, over the last few months and moving forward. So I figured it would be a good time to bring at least a subset of that content to a broader audience that maybe doesn't have the ability of attending some of those events, which are invite only. So today we're really going to focus on teamwork. So Microsoft has this new concept of what is collaboration and how do we collaborate within a team, and that's across all of Office 365. So obviously we're gonna start with a bit of a lay of the land, talking about teamwork within Office 365 and really talking about Office 365 groups. How do groups play into Outlook? How do groups play into SharePoint? How does SharePoint integrate with things like Yammer? How do we communicate back and forth with while collaborating in OneDrive and Office apps? And then we'll get into how does Microsoft Teams really enhance that quick teamwork. So before we get into too much of the presentation, I want to just ask a quick poll to the attendees.
Sure, and I'm launching it right now. It should be visible to all the attendees. The question that we are seeking answer for is, where are you in your journey of enhancing teamwork with Office 365 and Microsoft Teams? So you can select the answer which seems apt for your organization. We'll keep this on for next 10 seconds so that everybody can participate in it, and I'll broadcast the outcome for everybody's information post that. Okay, so we have response from everybody, and if I analyze the data, we have 34% of the respondees saying they are still planning the migration to cloud. We have 45% who have adopted workloads like SharePoint and Exchange, and but they have not yet started work on Microsoft Teams. Close to 30% have widely adopted Teams and are awaiting further features So that's the response, snapshot of response we have from approximately 80% of the respondees.
Excellent, appreciate it. So it looks like we have a good blend of people who are going through this journey in multiple phases, where they're currently planning, adopting maybe some of those workloads, or even taking advantage of everything, including what we're here to talk about today, teams. So let me start just with a little bit of an architecture of what teamwork looks like within Office 365. So when we talk about Office 365, obviously we all recognize that there is various workloads that fit within that technology suite, right? So the most common ones obviously are Outlook, SharePoint, Yammer, OneDrive and Office, and Teams. And the modern experience and the modern capabilities really all fit within this concept of Office 365 groups and the Microsoft Graph. And obviously there's security and compliance that encompass all of that. So originally, when we rolled out Microsoft Teams and Office 365 groups and the modern SharePoint experience and modern team sites, I think there was a ton of confusion on really what is the difference between a group and a Microsoft team, and is there a one-to-one correlation? Are they competing technologies? So at least over the course of the last 18 months, there's really been a better communication around what is an Office 365 group. And that Office 365 group is really just a membership service. So when you're thinking about building an architecture for your organization and taking advantage of 365, obviously you want to support security and control permissions with something like an Office 365 group. So the group is really the underlying framework and architecture for laying upon these various teams. So if we create a group called IT, and if we want to have a Power BI workspace for that team, well, as soon as I create that Office 365 group, I get a workspace for my IT group in Power BI. I get a workspace in Planner. I actually can get a SharePoint site created for that team and for that group. And we have the ability of creating a Microsoft team based on that group as well. So what we try to tell everybody is when you begin planning your architecture for how do we roll out SharePoint, how do we create departmental sites, how do I start doing more collaboration with Microsoft Teams, we tell everybody that, you know what, you really want to start with that underlying framework of that group. And obviously when we start talking about standing up architecture, the first thing that we want to do is plan for governance around that, because out of the box, people have the ability of automatically creating and provisioning these groups. And as I mentioned, when you create these groups, there's a lot of other spokes that are created automatically. So you certainly want to be able to provide some security and protect the ability of not necessarily creating unwanted SharePoint sites, let's say. So there is an entire governance that you can configure around Office 365 groups themselves. So if we take a quick look at, this is my Office 365 administrative tenant, right? And I'm in my groups, and this has obviously changed the user experience over the course of the last 12 months, where we've got a new UI around it. But you can see that I've got a bunch of different groups created. I have distribution lists, and I have Office 365 groups themselves. And I obviously have the ability of adding a new group here. So this is within my Office 365, and I just click on groups. Now, there's also an ability of taking distribution lists that you've already created or already synchronized using Azure Active Directory Sync and loaded them up into the cloud and converting those into an Office 365 group. So if I actually go to the old Exchange admin console, or you can see that I've got a list of the same distribution lists and O365 groups that I have here, but I've got this ability of upgrading. And if I click on that upgrade button, you see that I have this process which allows me to bulk upload those distribution lists into the Office 365 groups. Also, obviously, Office 365 is all built on top of Azure Active Directory. So it would make sense that I would be able to manage my Office 365 groups through my Azure portal as well. So here you can see that I've got my Azure Active Directory for my demo tenant set up, and I've gone to that Active Directory, and I can click on my groups, and I have the ability of seeing what all the groups were, and there was a view very similar to what I showed you prior, but you can also see that there's some configurations that I can do, right? You can define self-service, you can select people that can actually create these groups. So again, when I talked about that governance a few slides back, this is where you can configure that governance around who has the ability of managing, maintaining, and creating these groups, and you do all of that through Azure Active Directory. One of the newer features that have rolled out recently is actually the ability of creating dynamic Office 365 groups. So, back in the day, tons of people created dynamic distribution lists where they could set in some query parameters, and based on that it would automatically search for users that had those properties, let's say, in their Active Directory. And so I didn't have to worry about, if I hired a new employee, going and adding them to a ton of different groups. It was really just based on those 80 properties. So similarly, now within this Azure Active Directory portal, I've got the ability of creating my Office 365 group, and again, creating a dynamic distribution type, being able to create those dynamic queries. We can have advanced rules, simple rules, what have you. So this really allows us to, again, plan the governance around who creates the groups, how are the groups created, gives us the ability of creating those dynamic groups, and really eliminating the fact that we needed distribution lists anyway. So that being said, the first real workload that we launch when we go to Office 365, low-hanging fruit, typically ends up being Outlook. I'm not going to talk too much about what Outlook is. I'm pretty sure everybody understands email. So really what we want to talk about is, how does Outlook and the user experience that I get from modern Outlook web app, as well as Outlook 2019, let's say, how does that lay into this teamwork capability, and where can I see my Office 365 groups, and what does that experience really look like, right? So here I am, I'm in my inbox, and this is my general inbox up at the top, but you can see that I'm actually associated, I'm a member of multiple groups. So the same way that you would have, archive folders, what have you, within your inbox or within your Outlook, you can have these Office 365 groups that are visualized as well. So obviously there's the ability of having, emails. The groups can be email enabled internally. You can set the groups to be externally email enabled. So, a lot of the times when we're migrating to Office 365, people wonder if we need to have external groups, and being able to email those external groups. Even from a SharePoint perspective, there used to be the ability of having a document library that was email enabled, and that functionality doesn't exist anymore, really. But what we have the ability of doing is we have the ability of creating these groups, which can be email enabled, and we can actually run like a Microsoft flow that reads every time there's a new email that goes into this group email, and we could run that flow and actually take any of that information and load it up into a SharePoint site, right? So even though that the old functionality doesn't exist, there's a new architecture and a new process which allows us to get the same user experience. So here I am, again, I've got my emails that I can see here, and you can see up at the top, I've got a bunch of different capabilities. I have my emails, which are my conversations, but I also have my files. So this is going to show me a list of documents which are actually created and stored within SharePoint itself. So the same document library that I can access from SharePoint, I have the ability of accessing from my Outlook by going to that group and going to the files as well. I can upload new documents, add new content, etc. Same from a calendaring perspective, right? We used to have shared calendars. Now we have group calendars. You can see that I've got my generic calendar, and maybe I have my IT group calendar, and they get overlaid in the same user experience. There's a OneNote notebook. I have the ability of going to like a planner site that shows tasks related to this IT group, and I can actually directly go to that SharePoint site itself where the files ended up living, as I had mentioned earlier. So the real idea around having this integration with Outlook is, look, obviously we're trying to take collaboration and communication and make Outlook not be the main mechanism for that. That being said, we as an IT organization need to understand that there are different people that work in different methods. So we all obviously want everybody to stop copying documents, putting them in an email and sending them to somebody. So how do we sort of start driving adoption of, let's store that content in something like a SharePoint and let's send a link to that content from SharePoint, and the ability of doing that is kind of saying, okay, while you're in Outlook, let's still give you that view into some of that SharePoint content. So that being said, let's sort of take a dive into what SharePoint is itself, right? Obviously, SharePoint is Microsoft's document management, web content management, collaboration, form workflow process tool, right? You have the ability of having files and lists, and there's news and pages and apps, and all of that really is wrapped around a portal in some aspect. So I like to show this slide where, if we talk about a corporate intranet, obviously corporate intranets have a bunch of different capabilities. There's visualization, security, web content management, document management, collaboration, process automation, all the things that I just mentioned. And there's a slew of capabilities that exist, within SharePoint. And then obviously we wrap all of that around search. So, these bottom 4 bars, I would say 10 years ago was very explicitly SharePoint, and people knew how to build these portals on top of that platform. Well, that being said, now with Office 365, there's a lot more that we need to think about instead of just SharePoint itself. Obviously, there's the Office 365 groups that we mentioned. There's security and compliance capabilities, and there's, Power BI and Delve and OneDrive and Teams and Stream and Planner and Yammer and Forms and Power Apps and Flow, and all of those capabilities sort of fit together in order to build you this true enterprise portal. So SharePoint itself now is really focused on delivering news, right? So web content management, being able to publish news articles, and there's the ability of having hubs and having associated hub sites so we can aggregate content across those various areas. We have the ability of having, we have the ability of having sites. Obviously, a site is sort of this area where we're housing content, securing that with permissions. We can have lists and libraries associated to those sites as well. As I mentioned, we have these hubs which are aggregating content from various areas. So for the most part, we have the ability of creating sites, right? Again, when we talk about governance, this is probably something that we should think about. Who has the ability of creating some of these sites? But this is a modern experience for, right, clicking on the SharePoint waffle within your Office 365 sort of gives you a view of your sites that you favorited or followed, or ones that have been sort of recommended for you. And I've got the ability of creating either a team site or a communication site. Obviously, both of these are the modern experience. Now, if I create this team site, let's recognize that a team site is not Microsoft Teams, right? A team site is a template that allows us to have an Office 365 group connected to that site. So basically, it ends up creating that underlying Office 365 group, which, remember, sort of gave me the ability of having a Power BI workspace and a channel for Planner, et cetera, et cetera. So if I create that team site, it's going to build all of that for me. Now, we also have the ability through our SharePoint administration to create other types of sites, right? So here I am in my SharePoint admin within 365, and I have an option for creating other templates, which didn't exist on that prior slide, right? This is more for end users, and this is more for administration. And you can see that I can actually spawn a team site, which is not connected to an Office 365 group. So what that allows us to do later on is say, okay, we're not ready to go full bore in with Office 365 groups. I don't want all those other workloads tied into it, but I want to start taking advantage of the modern experience, because that gives me things like responsive user experiences and all those new modern web parts. So what ends up happening is it spawns this site for you, obviously modern experience, and you can see that if I go to the settings, at any point in time, after the fact, I can go and I can connect this to an Office 365 group. So when I click on that, it basically tells me all the benefits that I'm going to get from doing that, right? I can use Planner for tasks, and I have all those conversations in Outlook, and we can end up creating teams associated to it. So let's get started, and it spawns that Office 365 group, and again, ties everything together for me again. So let's talk real quick about Yammer. So obviously Yammer has been Microsoft's enterprise social for the last few years, and there's certainly some confusion around when do I use Yammer versus when do I use Teams, and you might have heard of Microsoft's inner and outer loop that they talked about at Ignite last year, and that concept has sort of gone away as we've introduced the freemium version of Teams. So people that are external to your organization actually have the ability of collaborating with you within teams themselves. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So Yammer's really turned more into, it's the tool that allows us to communicate organization-wide. So when we talk about Yammer, you can see that I actually have a Yammer group, which is this associated to that Office 365 group that I have, and it's all tied together. And what Yammer has really done, or what Microsoft has really embedded in Yammer, is the ability of tying in these Office 365 resources. So even if I'm in Yammer, I can get to those same documents that I could get to in SharePoint, that I was able to get to from Outlook. I can go directly to the SharePoint site, or I can go to those planner tasks. So again, depending on the tool that I want to use, I can get to the same information without having to go through multiple hoops, or really myself having to recognize that I've got to cross technology platforms. So let's talk about OneDrive for Business and Office applications, and obviously one of the most valuable pieces of this is the OneDrive for Business sync tool, which has gone through multiple evolutions, right? We had Groove when this first rolled out, and then there was an actual OneDrive sync tool, and now with Windows 10 and the Creator update, right, it's all sort of embedded into Explorer itself. So it gives me the ability of taking that content, which not only exists in OneDrive, but also exists in SharePoint, and synchronizing that locally so I can take it offline, and I basically have the ability of working anywhere that I want to. There's mobile applications in iOS and Android that allow me to connect to OneDrive and SharePoint itself. I can view that same content within a desktop or within a tablet, and with the Office Online server, which is basically Office web apps, I have the ability of right in the browser viewing Word, PowerPoint, Excel content, and not only that, I have the ability of editing it. And obviously with Office 2016, 2019, with the new modern web applications, I have the ability of having this co-authoring. So now my teamwork expands beyond just, hey, I want to talk about this concept, or I want to talk about this process, or we want to talk about this project, to we're actually building a document, we're building content collaboratively, real time, through this co-authoring. So, here's just a quick view on OneDrive for Business, really. So OneDrive for Business is more my personal files, right? So if you guys typically have home directories or H drives on your file shares today, that content really should live in OneDrive for Business, because it's something that I am sort of individually have permissions around, whereas more that collaborative content obviously would exist in a SharePoint site. But you can even see here that even with my OneDrive for Business or OneDrive for Business view, I have access to those same groups, which have those same SharePoint document libraries that I had in the past. And there's a ton of security that we can control around accessing to OneDrive for Business, obviously, because if we're doing that OneDrive for Business sync, raises a whole concern around security and compliance. So do I want to be able to synchronize my work content on my personal desktop? And obviously the answer is probably no. So how do you do that? You can put permissions in place which allow only access from certain IP addresses, or when you're connected to a domain. And then there's a whole compliance section where you can do things like set retention policies and do e-discovery and set up, DLP policies around that content. So you really have the security and controls around OneDrive or Business, and honestly, you have the same thing around SharePoint with IRM and stuff. So this is really the fundamentals around collaboration and teamwork within Office 365. So now let's talk about how does Teams really play into this strategy. So obviously Teams is sort of your one-stop shop hub for teamwork. It allows me to communicate. It allows me to have chats. It allows me to set up meetings. It allows me to do calls. It allows me to collaborate with my teams by uploading files or directly embedding files in a persistent chat. It allows me to actually create applications or download applications from a store, which allow me to integrate with third-party technologies, etc. And obviously I can do all of this while I'm, again, working in a web application, working on a thick client desktop, or working on a mobile device itself. So really, as I mentioned, Hubs is this immersive technology which allows me to have a one view into multiple capabilities of Office 365. So again, we've got the chatting, we've got the document management, document collaboration. We can show Power BI and Planner and Stream tabs. We have the ability of creating our own bots and connectors, et cetera, et cetera. So from a chatting perspective, obviously this is taking over a bit of what Skype for Business was, right? So we had Office Communicator way back in the day, and that sort of morphed into Link, which morphed into Skype for Business, which is now morphing into Teams, and it's really going to live in Teams from now on. A lot of the capabilities that we had in Skype for Business are now rolling into Teams itself, at least from a chatting perspective, right? And there's a whole upgrade capability where you can go to your Teams administration and you can set people in islands mode, or you can set people in Teams only mode, and you can do it organization wide, or you can do it for certain individuals. So you can actually pilot the rollout of Teams for a lot of your chatting and collaboration. Recognize that the integration between Skype for Business and Teams isn't exactly seamless. It's getting a little bit better, right? But usually you're going to see that there's capabilities that don't exist when two people are collaborating across those technologies. Obviously, Teams, much like Skype for Business, has the ability of having meetings. We have the ability of recording those meetings out. I can take those meetings from a mobile device. We can actually have ad hoc meetings with other members that are using Teams. If I try to set up an ad hoc meeting with somebody from Skype for Business, or if somebody from Skype for Business tries to set up an ad hoc meeting for me and I'm using Teams, it'll actually send out a meeting link instead of just doing it directly within the tool itself. So again, some integration is getting better, but obviously there's still, need to recognize these are two completely different architectures, Teams and a Skype for Business, let's say. And now the international calling, the domestic calling, right, having the cloud PBX capabilities, all of that has now rolled into Microsoft Teams as well. So everything that I could do in Skype for Business, again, from a calling perspective, has now rolled into Teams. And obviously we're doing all of that while integrating with other tools and technologies that fit in this Office 365 suite. So some of the newer capabilities that have rolled out that sort of help us with collaboration is obviously inline translations. That's something that Office 365 is getting better at as a whole. Something that you'll be seeing coming to SharePoint as well in the near future is better translation capabilities. Obviously, the integration with SharePoint itself has gotten better, where I have the ability, and I'll show this in a little bit, of taking SharePoint content and saving that in Teams, and then actually showing Teams content and having that in SharePoint, right? Just simple things like, private chats and private screen shares wasn't even in Teams, 8 months ago, and that stuff is there now. So obviously, again, with Office 365 and Teams sort of being this greenfield technology, there's new features and functionality that just continue to roll out over the course of time, and that really helps us improve with our teamwork and collaboration. So Teams really is, again, about this integrated experience. So how do I have one place where I can see news, content? How do I collaborate? How do I have persistent chat? Where do I see third-party applications, etc. So if we want, right, I've got my persistent chat here in Teams. Well, I have the ability of sharing SharePoint content within that as well. Obviously, you can see that I've got files and stuff. I've got some other screenshots and a little bit later that show the same thing. And then I can actually show, as I mentioned, metadata related to the files. So all of that content can be in SharePoint as well. I can embed a SharePoint page in Microsoft Teams. And not only that, if I have an app, let's say, that I've deployed in Teams, or if I have some customization that I've done in Teams, I have the ability of showing that back in SharePoint as well. So what we're really trying to do is bridge the gap between when do I use Teams and when do I use SharePoint. So a lot of people come to me and say, hey, you know what? Why do we really need this? Why do we need an intranet now if I have Teams? And my response to them is typically, look, Teams is just another presentation layer on top of that intranet. But you still need to build out your intranet. You still need your corporate landing page, which has your news and announcements and corporate events. You still want to have your department sites for HR, IT, communications, compliance, finance. You still want to have your team sites. But what you're doing is you're building all that around, as I mentioned, those Office 365 groups. So I've got all of that, Power BI and Planner and OneNote, all those capabilities, again, tied to that same group, tied to that same SharePoint site. And now you create a Microsoft team based on that, and you really have this, homogeneous ecosystem where I can go to multiple places and see the same information. But Teams can sort of be that one-stop shop to, now I want to collaborate on this specific project or product, and I want to see everything. I don't want to have to navigate between various areas, so that's the goal. So if you remember earlier on, I showed a screenshot around having an Office 365 connected team site, right? I went through the process of connecting it, and you can see then I have the ability of saying, you know what, I've got this group site, I want to create a team related to it. So as soon as I click on that, it actually spawns a team for me, and I have the ability of launching Microsoft Teams and having some of those capabilities that we walked through. So obviously I'm connected to a bunch of different teams here, right? Some of them can be departmental, some of them can be project or product related, and I have my persisted chats. Obviously these persisted chats are nice because, what it really takes us away from is me sending an email to a couple of people, and then somebody forwards it on to somebody else, and somebody else, replies and includes, yet another person. So now what do? We've got completely disconnected communications through 3 different email threads. And not only that, the people that we added later on into that process, sure, they can scroll down and read as many, previous emails as possible, but they don't get any information related to those other 2 sidebar email conversations that are happening. So this persistent chat really gives me the ability of, you know what, we're collaborating here as a team. I realize that I want to add somebody else into it, and I add them to the team, and they have the ability of going and seeing all the information, all the content, all the documents, all the spreadsheets that we've loaded up, all the conversations, all the chats, and I can see all of that for all the users that we add near real time once we've added them into those groups. So as I mentioned, we've got the ability of showing SharePoint content here, right? So within my team site, within my Microsoft Teams, I can see the documents that exist in my SharePoint team site. And if I click on this open in SharePoint, it's actually going to bring me to a team site with the same name. I've got a bunch of different information related to it. And I've got those documents, and you can see that my documents are actually in a folder called Go-to-Market Plan. So if I jump back a slide, you can see that I've got this team, and there's a bunch of different channels that we've created. So today, every channel, the permissions have access, the access permissions are the same globally across that team. One of the enhancements that's rolling out is the ability of actually creating some permissions on a channel by channel basis. So you can see, though, at least from a content perspective, that it's getting grouped into a folder, again, with the same name as that channel. Of course, I'm in SharePoint. I could click back and I could go to Documents, and it would show me a list of all the folders which have content in them. And I have the ability of doing, obviously, enterprise search, so I can search across any of the information that's in this site. If this site was connected to a hub, I could do a hub search, etc. So if we go back to Teams, one of the nice things that exists now that, again, wasn't even there, a couple of months ago, is the ability of connecting other storage capabilities. And really what that means to me is, hey, you know what? I created these SharePoint sites a long time ago, and they've got some really relevant data. I don't necessarily want to delete those SharePoint sites. They're being used, they've been adopted, but the content that's in those sites is maybe relevant to this team. So how do I connect that document library to this team so I have the ability of connecting to it, right? So what I've done is I've clicked on the SharePoint. You can see I just happen to have an HR training audit library. This library exists in a completely different site somewhere, but I have the ability of getting to that information now because I've connected it. So not only do we have the ability of doing that with SharePoint, but I have the ability of doing that with other third-party applications. So minus just files, we have the ability of having things like embedded, PowerPoint documents, embedding Excel content, embed Word documents, embedding PDFs, creating, wiki pages. So we can add these tabs, they're called, which really allow us to these different views into these different technologies, all within this same team. We can embed, very rich Power BI content that even has filtering capabilities, right? Power BI is our business intelligence tool of choice that can connect to SharePoint list information. It can connect to SQL data, it can connect to, different third-party line of business applications, etc. And it's a rich, intuitive um, uh, Power BI tool. So I can actually do a lot of, refining right within the context of these charts and reports and analytics. So I can embed that directly in my team site as well. Not only that, but as I mentioned a few times, we have the ability of having those planner tasks. So again, I've got this one-stop shop, which allows me to access multiple content which sits within that Office 365 realm. So not only do we have Microsoft's out of the box tools and capabilities and features, but obviously, we all love developers and we love to build our own connectors and integration points, etc. So Teams allows us to do that, right? We can create our own tabs, we can create chatbots, we can create our own connectors, or we can go to the store and we can download a bunch of that stuff ourselves. So a lot of the leading technologies and capabilities around, HRIS systems and help desk and ERPs, etc. So they've built their own little add-ins which we can connect to Teams. So you can see that I go to the store. There's a bunch of capabilities that I have the ability that I can choose from, and I can actually add and install these apps either individually or I can install them as organization-wide applications. So I downloaded a quick little Wikipedia app, right? So it allows me to do some enhanced searching where if I go to the search bar that exists within Teams, I can do a quick search on how much wood could a woodchuck chuck, and it's going to give me answers to that. Not only can we do apps that do searching, but we can actually integrate other applications as well. Sorry, like Microsoft Flow. So Microsoft Flow, obviously the new workflow tool that exists and sits on top of Office 365 and allows us to create processes cross technologies. So we can have a Dynamics 365 content roll into SharePoint, or as I mentioned earlier, we can have that email which goes to that Office 365 connected group and send it directly to SharePoint, so we can build that process a little bit. So right within Teams, I can see a list of my flows, I can see a list of my approvals that I need to access. And not only that, there's a bot capability which allows me to say, hey, kick off this flow. So you can actually run flows from Teams itself as well. And then there's the ability of creating your own bot application. So this is just a bot that we've created that uses Lewis for some intelligent language searching. And it's a custom bot that we've deployed to Teams, and you can see that I can ask simple questions like, I need to request a day off. And what it does is it realizes that day off relates to a leave request form, so it can display this nice leave request card directly in Teams itself. I can fill out this form and save it, and it saves, let's say, to a SharePoint list, and I can run a Microsoft flow on that SharePoint list for a review and approval related to that leave request. So what this means to me is I don't have to go to my intranet and remember that I've got to go to a place that says HR and a place that says HR forms, and then click on a form and then have this pop up. I can just directly chat with somebody and chat with this bot, tell them I need a day off, and this form pops up. Similarly, you can do the same thing for I want to enter, submit a help desk ticket, etc. So, as I mentioned, we certainly want to bridge the gap between functionality and capability that exists in Teams and exists in SharePoint. So let's say we can take that same bot and that same framework and apply it in SharePoint itself. So I've got this little bot that exists on the bottom of my screen. I've asked it the same question. That same form pops up within SharePoint. So really what we're trying to do with Teams is provide a new ecosystem of collaboration where I have access to all the information that I need to be able to make educated decisions right at my fingertips. But that doesn't mean that there certainly isn't a place for SharePoint as your enterprise portal, and OneDrive for Business for your personal content, and Outlook for your emails. There is this whole connected ecosystem that exists within Office 365, which really enhances us and our teamwork today. So that ends my presentation. We've got some time left, and hoping that we have some questions and answers.
Thank you, Justin. We will go ahead and take the questions, but before that, for all the attendees, please be sure to type your questions in the question box in your control panel. There are about 9 questions that I see for now. The first one is, what is the user experience if my organization doesn't have a SharePoint in Office 365?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Obviously, everything that I've talked about today has really been focused on Office 365, right? Microsoft Teams itself is a 365 capability only, right? If an organization doesn't have Office 365, then they don't have the ability of having Teams unless they have that freemium version, which allows them to basically collaborate with other organizations' Office 365 tenants. So that being said, obviously some organizations, and we realize this by the poll that we did earlier today, are still planning their migration to Office 365. Or maybe they've lit up certain workloads like Exchange, but haven't actually rolled out SharePoint Online yet. And most of those organizations have SharePoint on-premise. Unfortunately, if I go to a team and if I load up those files, or if I want to share content, it requires a subscription to SharePoint Online. So, most organizations have, business essentials or business premiums or E1, Z3, Z5 licenses. And within all those licenses, you actually have SharePoint Online as a capability. But that being said, it doesn't mean that the organization has rolled out that workload yet. So if none of the users actually have access to SharePoint, they'll be able to use Teams, but they won't be able to load up documents, etc. If even one SharePoint site's been created within that Office 365 tenant, it actually at least creates the structure that exists and allows the creation of those Office 365 groups and the SharePoint sites on top of those groups, which would then allow people to get the full functionality within Microsoft Teams itself. So it doesn't necessarily mean that people have had to move all of their SharePoint on-prem to SharePoint Online, but you require at least some SharePoint Online instance and license in order to have the full functionality of Teams.
Sure. Okay. I hope that helps. The second question is, do features vary depending on which Office 365 plan is selected?
So no, it doesn't. Any of those plans that I had mentioned, the business to the enterprise, all of the functionality within Teams is the same. Now, that being said, obviously, if we have some robust Power BI reports that require Power BI Pro to connect to those third-party integrations, right, that report isn't going to be visible to somebody that doesn't have the corresponding license. But in general, all of the functionality that exists in Teams is the same across all license models.
All right. The next one is, even in Agile, we have collaboration feature. What is collaboration meant in Microsoft?
So, I mean, I would assume that Agile is more of a implementation rollout process, right? So it's a methodology, kind of like um, waterfall. You know, look, there are DevOps capabilities within Visual Studio, within VisualStudio.com, within things like you know Visual Studio Code and stuff like that, which allow you to sort of define agile processes. I would say this method of collaboration is more ideation, innovation, really trying to um, get a team of people to work together on a common goal and not necessarily define sprints or tasks sort of in the agile method. I think that they're kind of two separate thought processes.
And the next question is, what is the maximum bandwidth or scaling it has regarding bulk upgrade if the deployment is on-prem?
So again, I'm assuming that this is talking about uh, the distribution lists that I had mentioned have the ability of upgrading um, to the Office 365 groups, right? So the reality is you've got to have that Azure Active Directory sync working in order to synchronize those existing distribution lists to Office 365 and Azure Active Directory. And then once that happens, you have the ability of doing that bulk upgrade. I don't know of any exact limitations off the top of my head around any numbers or throughput or bottlenecks that there would be. I know that there's a whole Office 365 threshold um, that's on a TechNet article. So we could take a look at that and see if there's any specific limitations. But off the top of my head, I don't know of any.
Moving to the next question, we already have a lot of Office 365 groups, but I've noticed we have some with either no owners and or no members. Is there a report to get a listing of outdated or abandoned groups?
So if you go to the SharePoint administration, um, if they have a SharePoint site connected to them, then in the new modern SharePoint admin, you have the ability of exporting a report out that shows you all of the sites with a connected group and if there is an owner. Um, Otherwise, I would say that your best bet is to go to that Azure Active Directory portal that I showed you, and then we could run a report based on the groups that exist there. I don't know of a report that actually exists in the groups tab of Office 365 specifically for groups.
The next one that we have is with regards to AWS, and the question is, we can do all of these in Amazon cloud, so why is there a need for SharePoint?
I don't know if I necessarily agree with you can do all of these in Amazon cloud. I mean, look, obviously AWS and Microsoft Azure, I think, have a lot of similarities. Obviously, it's infrastructure as a service and it's platform as a service. We can stand up virtual machines. We can stand up, SQL instances. There's obviously an entire strategy in AWS for Microsoft on AWS. But that being said, everything that I showed today is very specifically software as a service. SharePoint Online, Exchange Online, OneDrive for Business, Office web apps, that's all SaaS, which does not exist within this AWS cloud.
And the next one says, OneDrive adoption has been very slow at my company, mainly due to security and permission concerns. Can you elaborate more on how the end business users can get comfortable with setting permissions on files they either want to keep private or only want to share with limited users?
Yeah, so look, we've seen adoption issues within OneDrive for Business, specifically if people have large home directories and home and file shares, and if IT hasn't really given a process to migrate that content, right, it becomes a little bit more difficult. But recognize that OneDrive for Business, by default, is permissioned only to the user who owns that library. And very explicitly, you have to share controls out. There are OneDrive for Business settings which will allow you to share information internally only, and explicitly you have to define that you want to allow external sharing from that OneDrive for Business. And then even when you share that content, you have the ability of saying, I want somebody to just have read access, or I want them to have the ability of actually editing the same content. So I would say it's probably just an education and a training, which would allow people to get some comfort level around, what's the process for sharing, and again, sort of making sure that at least the content that they're used to having available to them is there. Otherwise, you know what, it's tough to drive adoption when you tell people they've got to move their own content in.
All right, hope that answer helps. Moving to the next one, and this is in context to a team or SharePoint site. Question is, so that in this chicken and egg scenario, does it matters if the team or SharePoint site is created first? Are
So,
there any caveats to one or the other?
so absolutely. So if you go to Microsoft Teams and you create a new team, it will automatically create an Office 365 group, which will automatically create a SharePoint site with the modern team experience with that group name. So if you create a team, you have everything. So you've got to be able to manage, obviously, some governance around that. However, if you just, as I showed, you can create a modern team site that doesn't even have a group to start. And then you can add a group later. And then you can take that group and team site and create a Microsoft team later. So it gives you the ability of maybe doing a soft, slower rollout of the capabilities instead of, if you create the team, you get absolutely everything. So order certainly does matter.
Let's move to the next question, and this is an interesting one. I see meetings in your Teams interface. I don't see it in mine. Is that a setting in the tenant?
Yeah, so basically I have my tenant, or I have my team's configuration set to either islands in one instance and in Teams only mode in another. So it may be that your organization has it set up where Skype for Business is your meetings mechanism, but you still have the ability of having the persistent chat and the Teams collaboration within Teams itself. So there are certainly various configurations around Teams and Skype for Business and the integration, which would, again, as I mentioned, through that sort of soft, phased out rollout, would allow you to give users the ability of chatting and sharing files and stuff within Teams, but doesn't give them the full, private chat, meeting invites, calling capabilities that can exist.
Okay, next I see a couple of demo requests. So I think there are 3 people who are basically trying to check if we can give them a personalized demo.
So there's obviously trials available. If people are on there, hey, we're still planning our rollout to Office 365, you can get a 30-day trial of Office 365, which gives you the ability of having all these capabilities and testing out Teams, etc. And if that's something that you need help with, Microexcel, we're actually a direct CSP, so we have the ability of standing up those trials and sort of supporting you through that initiative. In addition, if it's more, hey, we'd like a deeper dive on some of these capabilities, and maybe, I thought this webinar was valuable, but I'd like to include other members from my team. We certainly have the ability of doing a very similar demonstration, maybe more targeted towards your industry and audience, if you wanted.
Okay, next one is, since this is replacing Skype, is there a Teams Online and Teams for Business, like Skype Online and Skype for Business?
So there is multiple capabilities to get to the same technology. So there is a web version of Teams, there is a desktop version of Teams, and there is a mobile version of Teams. So I don't necessarily have to have a desktop app in order to use this functionality. Similarly, if I'm on the road and I need to join a Teams call or a Teams meeting, I can do that directly from my phone, just like I could with a Skype for Business app. So yes, there are apps for all three capabilities.
Okay, and on the same lines, the next question says, certain people within our organization use Teams and rest use Skype for Business.
Mm-hmm.
Can people using Skype for Business communicate with people using Teams?
So yes, they can. Again, it depends on the administrative configurability. By default, it's something called islands, which means if you're running both Skype for Business and Teams, if I am chatting with Amit over Skype for Business, then it goes to his Skype for Business. If I am chatting with Amit over Microsoft Teams, it goes to his Microsoft Teams, right? So they can be treated as two completely siloed technologies. Or what you can do is you can set up certain users in Teams only mode or certain users in Skype for Business mode, which basically means that if I'm running Teams only mode and Amit's using Skype only mode, that I use Teams, I send him a chat, and it goes to his Skype for Business. If he's using Skype for Business and he sends me a chat, it goes to my Teams. So again, you definitely have the ability of uniquely identifying which individual user is going to use which tool throughout the process.
All right, so next one, which is the last question, says SharePoint is not a multi-tenant system. So do we have features like B2B MB Cantata for SharePoint? I'm not sure if I got the question.
I mean, I guess my quick response to that would be, I mean, SharePoint Online is multi-tenant, obviously, right? Everything within Office 365 is. Now your site collections are obviously unique to you. But that being said, yes, there is a B2B and a B2C capability within Azure Active Directory. So you can connect other domains into your Azure Active Directory and then share permissions to SharePoint through those B2B and B2C connections.
Okay, it looks like we have covered all the questions.
Great.
Justin, is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap up?
No, I don't. I just threw my contact information on the screen. Appreciate everybody joining and hope that everybody found this content fruitful.
Great. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate your being here, and we will be uploading the webinar recordings, and URL link will be shared through mail. Before you disconnect or log off, please complete the short 30-second survey to help us improve these knowledge sessions. And I thank you once again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.